I want to just take a quick minute to thank the folks at the Big 89 WLS in Chicago for permanently adding Coast to Coast on the weekends onto their roster. And so we will be there as we have been all around the country on Saturday nights now regularly with some of the most fascinating guests and some of what we like to think of anyway is the most provocative conversations you're going to hear anywhere on Coast to Coast AM with Ian Punnett with a face for how do you forget my own line? With a face for radio and a voice for print. Now listen, we have two things coming up. And I want to save a little time in this hour, maybe even to get to some open line calls before the end of this hour. But I want to get to a professor who's going to talk about the story you may have read about earlier in the week, the Arkansas mayor who believes that he had been a victim of a satanic cult. We were talking about this off the air. We were trying to find just the perfect guest for this, and I think we have, coming up a little bit later on this hour. Also, next hour, Tudor Parfit, Professor Dr. Tudor Parfit will join us. His new book is about the lost Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, famous from Raiders of the Lost Ark, not to be confused with the Ark of Noah, the Ark that some people believe has been found in various mountaintop locations across the Mideast. But the Ark of the Covenant, that is the specially designed carrying box that was used by the ancient Israelites to fight wars, to fend off enemies, and to go before them wherever they went. This ancient box, this Ark of the Covenant that contained the remains of the Ten Commandments, this almost magical device may have been found. Or should we say, it was found some time ago, and Tudor Parfit believes he has recently discovered that it had already been found. We'll tell you more about that coming up next hour. You do not want to miss this. He's a fascinating guy. You may have seen something about him already on the History Channel. The book is just out. It's getting a lot of play, and he's coming up next hour. First, we'll get to a little crypto news to get the show started next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. I think we definitely will do some open line calls. If you want to line up early, you can if you know the numbers, but we'll have a lot of things to get to this hour. You don't want to miss it, including a little bit more about this discovery on the Ark of the Covenant a little bit later on this hour before our guest, Tudor Parfit, which is just about the coolest name, Tudor Parfit. I keep going over that in my head, Tudor Parfit, because it doesn't even sound like the name that a human being would have, yet he does. And he actually, when you look at him, he looks like a Tudor Parfit, and you'll see what I'm talking about coming up a little bit later on. Anyway, big time show. Big time snows in Indiana and Ohio. Top in crypto news for tonight. The storm dumped 20 inches of snow on Columbus, broke records that were set back in February of 1910. And who knows where it will end before it's all over. I mean, other than downriver, because if everybody knows, record snows means record melts, and that could only mean record floods. Brace yourselves, everybody. It could be a very wet spring. Stay tuned. A gunman in Thailand shot dead 8 neighbors, including his brother-in-law, after tiring of their karaoke versions of songs like John Denver's Country Roads. Now, I don't know about Thailand, but I would think no jury in the United States would convict this guy of that. His name in Thailand, Weenus Chumkanard. Weenus Chumkanard, 52, said, "When I began shooting, nobody objected," he said, because they were also drunk. And Weenus Chumkanard, I wonder if that's a funny name in Thailand. Remember a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the future of men? How men coming into adulthood today have half the testosterone and sex drive of their grandfathers? Well, it's not just the U.S. The Telegraph reports French women are becoming increasingly assertive in their sexual habits, while 1 in 5 younger French men have no interest in sex. according to one of the most comprehensive surveys of the nation's love lives. One of the biggest changes in recent years, according to the report, was that male and female sexual behavior had become increasingly similar, and abstinence rates for men under 35 twice as high as that for women. Pepe Le Pew, where are you when we need you? Was that a big cat prowling around in a graveyard in England? The Larkfield Area News reports the mystery of big cats roaming the countryside has once again been thrown under the spotlight. According to Neil Arnold of Kent, the Kent Big Cat Research Group, a black leopard known as the Beast of Bluebell Hill is back on the prowl. Latest sighting took place on Saturday at Rochester Cemetery on Maidstone Road by a man just walking home. Mr. Arnold reports the man glanced up into the cemetery and was astonished to see the animal. The cat was moving between the headstones. It was black in color with a very long tail which touched the ground. Maybe that cat escaped from the movie 10,000 BC. You've seen the saber-toothed tiger in the promos. If it did, no one would blame it. From what I've read, everybody has tried to escape from the theaters where 10,000 BC is being shown this weekend. Although it'll be number one at the box office, it's going to be, they say, a big disappointment for the promoters. My friend Willie Waffle, who's a movie reviewer at wafflemovies.com, said, quote, he got so bored with the movie he started to notice that all of the primal warriors with scraggly hair had still had time to manicure their eyebrows, which is historically inaccurate, he said, as well as being a bad sign that you just couldn't care less about how the movie ends. I hope Iron Man isn't that bad. The trailer looks great. I watched the trailer about 5 times today. Iron Man, it's coming up in May. At first, I doubted whether Robert Downey Jr. would make a good Tony Stark, but the more I watched it, the more I realized how perfect he was to play a spoiled, college-educated man-child who's had a major life change and decided not to be such a baby. Heck, Iron Man could have been cast in the Robert Downey Jr. story, for that matter. Speaking of movies, Europe is set to launch the biggest, most sophisticated spacecraft in its history. BBC reports the automated transfer vehicle is an unmanned spaceship that can carry up to about 8 tons of supplies to the International Space Station. Its other primary role is to push the orbiting outpost higher into the sky to keep it from falling back to Earth. The vehicle has been named Jules Verne for the flight on Sunday. But come on, a big giant space barge? Would it have killed the French to name it the Nostromo? A device that reveals what a person sees by decoding their brain activity could soon be a reality, according to researchers who developed a more sophisticated way to extract visual stimuli from brain signals. Scientists at the University of California, Berkeley, developed a computational model that uses functional MRI data to decode information from an individual's visual cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for processing visual information. Quote, our research makes substantial advances towards being able to decode mental content from brain activity. This will be one of the things we may get to coming up tomorrow night. I'm hosting Coast to Coast AM on Sunday night, and the subject will be our brains. And in particular, creativity. Why are some brains creative and others aren't? What is it about the brain that can account for the disparities in creativity? If we all have the same tissue, if we all have the same material elements that comprise our brains, why are some people capable of doing art and other people aren't? We'll get into that coming up tomorrow night with an expert on brains. But this research is interesting because it's able to decode mental content from brain activity, which is good news for husbands like me. A device that can finally help me understand just what the hell my wife is trying to tell me half the time. And we'll get to the story of the mayor of an Arkansas town resigning on Wednesday, claiming he was abducted and brainwashed by Satan worshipers nearly 5 decades ago, coming up a little bit later on this hour. But first, let's do some open lines on Coast to Coast AM. And Bill is east of the Rockies in Augusta, Georgia on Coast to Coast AM. Bill?
Hey, Ian. Listen, man, I've really enjoyed the shows, especially the last couple of shows with regards to the latest on D.B. Cooper, and I was anxiously, as I told your producer, sitting on pins and needles here looking for any update. And just to tell you that my image of D.B. Cooper is a kind of a Blues Brothers kind of character that jumps out of a plane, not to pay a gambling debt, but to do something more useful with the money. But apparently,
you mean help save the orphanage? You know, something like that. He's giving the money to the Penguin. Is that what you mean? I guess you're right. If you put a pork pie hat and some sunglasses on D.B. Cooper, he would look like he's in the Blues Brothers. I haven't thought of that before. No update yet. We're waiting for DNA information. It is the kind of thing that our investigator on this, Galen Cook, doesn't want to push too fast, doesn't want to, get the FBI to make a mistake. So they're taking their time, and hopefully we'll have something more to report in the weeks ahead. I will. I promise.
I'm praying that he has this person who claims he is, this deceased person who claims he is D.B. Cooper. I'm praying that he has a diary and has explained it all, and maybe you guys can.
Oh, wouldn't that be cool?
That'd be really cool.
I hadn't even thought it would be neat. It would be just cool enough just to have the physical evidence. Hadn't really thought about what it would be like if we actually had some sort of written confession that they were able to find wedged between the floorboards of his bedroom or something like that. West of the Rockies, Dan is in San Francisco on Coast to Coast AM, open lines. Hey, Dan.
Hi, Ian. Great fan of yours, long-time listener.
Thank you.
Wish you were on more.
We'll be on tomorrow night. It'll be fun.
Yeah. I want to talk to you. I've been trying to call for a long time on this, about the concept, I guess you'd call it, of the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
And the whole world seems to think that Immaculate Conception refers to Jesus being implanted in Mary without her having sex.
Right. That's the virgin birth.
That's the virgin birth. But the Immaculate Conception is actually Mary. It's in the litany.
Yeah. It's the belief that Mary's mother was able to conceive Mary without sinning.
Well, thank God for you, because you're the only one in the world that agrees with me.
No, it's pretty well accepted theory. Although you're right, those two things have become sort of blended over time, and people tend to
I just saw it on the
little
man Tate. And
do they make that mistake in that?
Yes, and it always appalls me, and I always give everyone the lecture. And I thought I'd consult you, and
sure.
You agree with me.
Well, it's a matter of agreement. It's the only way you can define that. There is no. I mean, I don't agree with the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception in the sense that I don't understand why we have to say that Mary's mother was so pure that she didn't know Mary's father was having sex with her. I don't know what that proves.
Well, I don't think that's what it means. It means that Mary was allowed to be conceived without original sin. It has to be that because Mary's mother was uninterested, was a non-sinning participant in the activity. She was so pure, and I just that's never been one. I see it a little differently. I see it as Mary being born pure, so that she can carry the Messiah.
I understand that's what you're saying, but that's there's just a tad bit more to it than that. But I appreciate the perspective and glad I passed the test. Let me get to wildcard line, Long Island on Coast to Coast AM. This is John. John?
Yes, how are you doing tonight?
Good. Open lines, where are you going to take us?
I just want to talk about the increasing UFO sightings that's going on. I would like to know if there's a specific website that you know of. I guess you can't just give one individual one out, but like something I can really find out that how many sightings are really occurring and where throughout the world.
Wow, throughout the world. When you say really occurring, what do you mean by that?
Just regular reported sightings to news channels, to whatever. Just you can't get every sighting, but like every year it seems to increase more and more. But I'm wondering how these people can actually, because you can only get so much on the news.
Right. No. Well, have you tapped into MUFON yet?
No.
Okay. Here's what you do. You just go Google that, because you're in Long Island, so I wouldn't know the exact name of the website. But if you go to the web and just MUFON, MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, you'll find out which one of those might correspond closer to you, or if you want to get an international perspective, I'm pretty sure you'd be able to link up from there. But what it'll give you is a already kind of an overview of the reports that are coming in, the interesting things. And, of course, you can just keep looking at the website, too, on coasttocoastam.com, because we tend to post a lot of them. But your point's well taken. You're going to see, like, numbers, and that's the best way to do it. Get in touch with the people who are tracking it around the world. There may even be some other groups, too. So try Googling for a chat room that focuses on UFO reports, and you'll get probably a lot more personal contacts, people that are either have their own websites or would be willing to put you on a mailing list for the latest information. Wildcard, Anita is in St. Louis on Coast to Coast AM. Anita?
Hey, Ian, hi.
Hi.
Oh, I love you, and I love the show.
Thank you.
Anyway, tonight I was listening to an old podcast back in December. I guess George did David Sereda.
Okay.
And anyway, he happened to bring up the fact that there is, with the use of like LSD, I'm sorry, I'm really nervous, but the fact that it will put you in touch with demonic beings, right?
Okay.
Okay, well, we have all these school shootings and all of these, well, you're just talking about one more. Who knows? This guy might have been on antidepressants. And an antidepressant is a psychotropic drug.
Well,
right?
you're talking about the SSRIs, right? You're talking about the
SSRIs, yeah.
Okay.
And so if you believe what David Sereda says, which is it puts you in touch with these demonic beings and the potential for being possessed, then the SSRIs potentially are doing that same very thing. And I just thought that, I just made that little connection tonight and thought I'd pass it along.
Well,
but,
I think just so we're clear, you're talking about David Sereda, and it's a very interesting thing. I mean, I hadn't heard him say that, so I can't make that connection exactly in how he's doing it. The SSRIs are a cousin of psychotropic drugs, as I understand it.
Correct.
But that's not the same as being one. But
True.
it is a question mark as to how many people can process these drugs in their body. And that Dr. Ann Blake Tracy, who's often on the show, says that there's a percentage of the population, probably less than 10%, but there's a percentage of the population that when these chemicals go through their bodies, when these SSRIs are processed, they don't break down in the same way that they do for the majority of people, and they do become like LSD. So does that tap into the demonic? Well, judging by their actions, it certainly is evil, and maybe that's all it has to be to fall into the category of the demonic is what they do with it. West of the Rockies, and I think it's Andrew, Tri-Cities, Washington, on Coast to Coast AM. Andrew?
Good evening, Ian. How are you doing tonight?
Couldn't be better. Where are you going to take us?
I don't know. Have you ever? I was watching a TV show called Destination Truth. It's on the Sci-Fi Channel.
I've seen it once, right?
You've seen it once, yes.
Seen it once.
Last week's episode, it was kind of interesting. You always talk about weird stuff. So there's a tribe that they were searching for the Yeti, which is the I believe on the other side of the world is the version of the Bigfoot.
Of course.
And there's a tribe up near Mount Everest where they supposedly have a scalp of an actual Yeti that they use for spiritual events to...
Yep.
Oh, you knew about that.
Well, this has been around for a while, although it would have been cool to see it on TV. There is a whole, up around the timberline, where there are still populations of people who have historically they have often been in contact or had contact with the Yeti, and have maintained, I think, more than even one or two relics. I mean, there are photographs. If you go back into some of the Yeti research, you'll find up there of
the scalp, skulls, other things that people have found, and they consider them to be sacred. I don't mean sacred in the sense quite maybe like we might mean it in the reliquary of a church or something like that, but it's pretty close. So, yeah, and I hadn't seen that particular episode, but I would like to. We were talking about Yeti just a couple of weeks ago, and I think we will again, so stand by. Whenever there's something new and interesting going on with cryptozoology, the Coast to Coast won't be too far behind. All right, so we have this amazing story. We'll share it with you coming up next. And the guy who probably knows a thing or two about whether or not it's true. The mayor of an Arkansas town resigning on Wednesday, claiming he was abducted and brainwashed by Satan worshipers nearly 3 decades ago. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. All right, so we'll get to we're going to get to Dr. James Richardson here coming up in just a second. Now, let me give you a little bit more about the story I mentioned earlier on Coast to Coast AM, because it is pretty amazing. And the question is whether anything like this is ever true. And you hate to say, well, this guy's a liar, but maybe there's another explanation. But anyway, in the news this week, you may have read, the mayor of an Arkansas town resigned on Wednesday, claiming he was abducted and brainwashed by Satan worshipers nearly 3 decades ago. Centerton Mayor Ken Williams said he's been living under an assumed name for nearly 30 years. He'd been mayor since 2001. Williams told authorities he was born Don LaRose, and in the mid-1970s he was a preacher in Indiana. He said he was abducted and brainwashed into forgetting all about his life as Don LaRose. It was a double life he had never acknowledged, Williams said, because he didn't even realize that he existed until he had recently taken a truth serum injection. As Williams regained his memory, he said he realized that he had a wife and 2 kids, that he had decided to leave and take on a new identity to protect them, presumably from the Satan worshipers. I had no choice. The choice was to watch my family killed before my eyes or go with these people, and I chose instead to run. He couldn't explain from whom he was running, saying only that he had been brainwashed. I had a couple of shock treatments. Williams said it took 5 years to get my memory back. We'll pick it up there in just a second. Can a story like this ever be true? I mean, are there red flags that kind of go off through this whole story for you? Or do you believe this guy? We'll talk about it with somebody who's been studying these types of stories, somebody who's written about the Satanism scare of the 80s, and also on other issues of sociology and judicial studies. Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Well, thank you for fitting us in on short notice. Dr. James Richardson, a professor of sociology and judicial studies at University of Nevada in Reno. I can't help but read a story like that and wonder, could this possibly be true? I mean, brainwashed, kidnapped by Satanists, 30 years on the run, taking truth serum. I mean, Dr. Richardson, what do you hear in a story like that right away?
Well, I have to admit I'm incredulous when I hear stories like that. There are just too many elements that don't make sense, or the odds are extremely long that anything like that could happen. There were lots of rumors back in the 80s of various things having to do with Satanist groups, and virtually all of them ended up being debunked. So I don't put much credence in stories like this, to tell you the truth. It's really interesting that this one's come out here in 2008.
Right, and I guess that's part of it too, because I remember when Geraldo Rivera was ginning all of that up, and everybody was looking for hypnotizing Satanists behind every garage. Are there any documented stories of satanic cults capturing people, brainwashing them, etc.?
No. I don't believe there are. All the study that I've done that led to my book called The Satanism Scare convinced me that these stories were just not credible. There were too many holes in them. That is not to say they're not groups that call themselves satanic groups, by the way. And in fact, one of the couple of the chapters in the book deal with teenage satanic-oriented groups. Teenagers back then found out they couldn't get any attention or upset mom and dad with sex, drugs, or rock and roll, so they tried out Satanism, and sure enough, that would get a lot of attention if they claimed to be Satanists. And there was a story out of that occurred in Nevada, in fact, in Elko High School. A couple of guys were going to play a practical joke, and they put a note in some girl's locker that said there was going to be a virgin sacrificed on a hill outside of Elko. And 2 days later, attendance had dropped to nearly 50% in the high school, and all the law enforcement people were out looking and everything else. And these kids finally admitted they'd just done it as a prank.
So are we to presume for that the 50% that didn't show up were all the virgins?
Well, I won't say too much about that.
They were the cautious virgins
listening, but it was an event that got national attention. Actually, when the kids owned up to it being a prank, that didn't make the news very much, of course. So there are people still out there thinking that they're satanic cults in Elko, Nevada, looking for virgins to sacrifice.
Well, but are there, I mean, in your research for the book or the research on a story like this, I mean, I know that you didn't have a lot of time on this particular story, but on things like this, is there evidence, are there ever satanic groups that try to kidnap people? And do they do that sort of thing? I mean, you mentioned that particular prank, but I mean, I've heard off and on throughout the years from various guests on the show or others that this is something that has happened to them. So is that part of the MO of satanic groups in general?
No. Again, you may find an instance here or there that I would really categorize almost as copycat behavior, where some people do some things not up to human sacrifice or anything of that nature. And then you do find some bizarre occurrences, like happened down on the border in Texas some years back, where some bodies were found buried, and all of a sudden that was attributed to some satanic group. So when strange kinds of things occur that people can't explain any other way, then it's something that floats around in the air in our society, and all of a sudden we hear talk about Satanism or Satanists doing this, that, or the other. And we do have, as I said, some people like to take advantage of that hysteria that can be developed so easily and go paint, 666 on a wall with spray paint or something, and all of a sudden there's a satanic scare in whatever town this happens. So it's kind of in the water in our culture, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and yet it only kind of bubbles up now and again. The McMartin school trial, let's talk about that a little bit, because that was such a fascinating case. First, because it just sounded so incredible that it almost had to be true. I mean, it was almost that all these kids were telling the same story at this McMartin preschool. Was it California? Is that where it was?
California. It was the most expensive trial in California history, and they actually tried it twice and couldn't get a conviction in either trial. There were underlying claims, that the McMartin preschool had been taken over or even set up to serve the interest of Satanists. Those claims were so incredible that when the case was tried, there wasn't much made about them in the courtroom. There was a lot made about them in the media, of course, but as I said, they never convicted anyone of anything in that case, and it was quite a cause célèbre for a long time.
Because the story was that this McMartin family that ran this preschool were taking the kids and they were bringing them on planes and they were taking them to other places, and then there they were being engaged in sexual activity and then threatened with death, and it was in the end, I mean, when we find out that none of these things actually ever happened, it really ends up sounding like the Salem witch trials all over again, just a level of hysteria where people may have sincerely believed the experience that they were having was true.
Right. We've seen a lot of research in the last 2 or 3 decades on the suggestibility of children that has raised very serious questions about the credibility of tales like that, but they can spread like wildfire. We had a case like that, in fact, in Carson City, Nevada, where a preschool, one child made claims that they'd sacrificed a family in the backyard and they'd even killed elephants and things, and so the authorities came out and dug up every backyard in the neighborhood and never found one bone. And yet those two people in charge of that preschool ended up being sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. It was overturned on appeal by the Nevada Supreme Court, the Ontiveros case, simply because of lack of evidence. It was totally dependent on a couple of children, and the evidence was just not there to support the claims, and yet a jury actually found them guilty on the basis of very weak evidence. And we saw this happening all over the country. There was a spat of these trials back in the 80s, as you may recall. The McMartin case was probably the most well-publicized, but there were cases in a number of states around the country where, it was almost like jurors were sending a message. The evidence may have been weak, but they didn't want anyone to think that they were going to abide any kind of satanic behavior associated with young children, and so some folks got sent up the river, and in some cases, there was a case in New Jersey where a woman spent 5 years in the penitentiary before an appeals court finally said there's no evidence to keep her. So we had this kind of hysteria that swept the country back then. It'll be really interesting to me to see if there are any more kind of copycat claims or cases that come out of this situation in Arkansas that prompted your call to me. And I guess I wouldn't be surprised. As I said, it's in the air, it's in the water, and if somebody wants to make these kind of claims, somebody will listen to them.
Well, I'll listen to it. I mean, somebody swears that it happened to them, and they don't seem to be making any money on it. And do they really believe that it happened to them? I'd hate to be the one that says, no, that's not possible. You never did it. And this is the person who really did go through it, and you can't get anybody to pay any attention or not.
That's right. Well, yeah. Anything is possible, by the way. I'm just telling you my impressions from reviewing a lot of research in this area.
Right. Oh, I know. And that's why you were really the perfect guy to talk about in this, because I listened to this. I'll read a little bit more of the story here just for the sake of argument. The mayor of Arkansas we're talking about, who had taken on a new identity in 1980 when he moved to Centerton, Arkansas. His full name, Bruce Kent Williams, was taken from a man who had died in a car crash back in 1958. What happened in 1980, whether it was right or wrong, I did it under the threat of my family and for my own survival. And that also is this theme that runs through some of these I was captured and brainwashed by a satanic cult story, is that there's always these sort of amazing threats that is happening to a family. It forces the person to have to do this. They don't want to, but they have to. And it almost makes them kind of heroic to have been getting away.
Right. And, the story has a number of problems. This one actually has a mechanism to get it. Supposedly brainwashing is this powerful technique. It's actually a pseudoscientific term and kind of a grab bag term, but this person came up with an innovative way to get out of being brainwashed, supposedly, and that is somebody gave him truth serum.
Yeah.
What that means, who did it, I mean, there are just a lot of murky details here.
Right. But kind of fascinating too, don't you think?
It's quite a tale. There's no, it's as if someone looked at the problems with these kinds of tales and said, "Well, I can fix that problem."
Right.
I got truth serum. But one of the whole thing about brainwashing is, I said, that's a pseudoscientific term and doesn't really have application. Again, the kinds of research, that term became very popular, as you may know, referring to what people call cults, joining new religions. I call them new religions, but the popular term is cults. And of assumption was no one in their right mind would join a cult unless they were brainwashed. And when you go in and do research on those kinds of groups, which I've done over the years, and you find out there are a lot of people in these groups because they didn't like the life they were living, and they made a choice to go live in the woods of Northern California or something, and they thought it was a better deal. And so there was a heavy volitional emphasis as opposed to some psycho techniques that had been invented by the Koreans or the Russians,
right.
Chinese. It was a lot of young people deciding to try a different lifestyle and a different ethic.
But and yet when you see something like the Manson family, and you read the stories about how the Manson family women, perhaps in particular, seem to get by a no protein. They felt physically like they became increasingly susceptible to the will of Charles Manson, and that Manson was this very persuasive figure. And you put those two things together, isolated from their families, told that nobody loves them but him, in sort of physical peril, all of these things, some psychological damage maybe to begin with. And I could see how that ends up to sort of washing the brain of somebody so that they became more impressionable to new suggestions. Would that be an unfair assumption that happens?
Well, the metaphor of washing the brain is problematic, but you can set up a situation where there's tremendous social influence and psychological coercion involved. Those kinds of situations are very rare. We would even refer to them as being situations of torture, perhaps. The Patty Hearst situation, for instance, is the place where everyone learned the term brainwashing.
Right, kept in a closet, denied protein.
She was raped. She was kept isolated. She was maltreated. That kind of physical coercion that she experienced is close to what might be looked at as brainwashing. The fact that she then participated in a bank robbery where someone was killed, as you may recall,
right.
The claim of brainwashing didn't get her off. At least initially, the jury found her guilty and she was sentenced to prison. She was eventually pardoned, so maybe she
I think she did in a way.
Won the war.
Yeah, I think she did. I think in one way she certainly got public sympathy to a larger degree because of the brainwashing claim. I think there were a lot of people.
It wasn't immediately successful in court, but it kind of broadcast that kind of claim that came out of the Korean War experience of POWs staying in Korea. We needed an explanation for that, so we kind of adopted the brainwashing term, which was a term. It actually appeared first in the English language in the 1950s in some books by a guy named Edward Hunter, who was supposedly writing about what was going on in communist China to change people's minds. We found out later that Edward Hunter was being paid by the CIA to write these books, which was kind of interesting. But he's the person that wrote that word down, and it became a popular term. And then we saw it, the attempt to use it in the Patty Hearst trial, and that was the O.J. Simpson case back then. I mean, everybody in the country was watching that trial, and they heard the testimony, and they heard the claims of a very flamboyant attorney talking about those kinds of claims. And so the term, and now it's part of the language, and it's interesting that term, it appeared slightly more than 50 years ago for the first time ever, but now we use it every day we refer to some kind of influence process that we don't particularly care for.
And that'll be the time that we have for this. But thank you so much, Dr. James Richardson from the University of Nevada in Reno. And I'd love to come back to you sometime when you get another book out. I'd love to be able to pick up this conversation. And thank you so much for offering your perspective on the story of the satanic brainwashed mayor. All right, but that leaves a thing. Have a wonderful night. Coming up, Dr. Tudor Parfit on the real story behind the Ark of the Covenant. He says he's found it, and we'll tell you where. And well, Tudor Parfit was a man I happened to catch a little of last week when I couldn't sleep. I think it was last Sunday. And this is just one of the reasons why I love the show Coast to Coast AM so much.
So I couldn't sleep. So I'm up watching a little late night television. Just so happens to have this cool program on the History Channel about the Ark of the Covenant. Well, I'm in. You know, I mean, I find these ancient mysteries are just infinitely fascinating. So I can never get enough. If I'm watching the History Channel and it's black and white footage of World War II or something about religious mysteries, I'm there. I could be flipping past. I could have I could be in church, and if I see that, I'll stop and I'll watch. So I was happy to catch most of this program that night, and then the next morning, my wife brought up an article that she saw in the newspaper. She said, "Hey, have you heard they found the Ark of the Covenant?" And they believe that they found it in Africa. And I said, funny you should mention that. I said, I was just watching something last night. And then I happened to mention that to Lisa Lyon, producer of Coast to Coast AM. And I said, could we happen to get this guy? And then, like magic, the book just appeared in my mail a couple of days later. And here he is coming up next. The guy behind it all, the fascinating saga of a cross, sort of a transcontinental trek. To find what some people thought could never possibly be found. Some people claim could never existed in the first place. The Ark of the Covenant of Moses, next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Dr. Tudor Parfit, I have to confess to you right away, I went online to look up a little bit more about your biography, and I couldn't find much. And I'm frustrated by that because I know you must have a fascinating personal history, and all I found out mostly is kind of what you're doing.
Because our university website's just been redone, and that's the main source, if you like.
Is that it? So,
yeah, but I've been a professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies for the last 20-odd years, and that's my main base. I've written 20-odd books, and I live between London and the south of France.
Which is where we're catching you right now, as I understand it.
That is correct, yes.
How's the weather in the south of France today?
Well, it's kind of cold and frosty this morning, but it's going to be warm later on, I reckon.
I'd like to compare your definition of frosty and cold and mine here in Minnesota.
Yes, I should think it's absolutely frozen.
Okay. All right. You say frosty, I'm thinking, not really, not much. And where did you study before you became a professor?
Yes, I studied at Oxford University in England.
Okay.
And I also studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
And this is relevant because, I mean, you come at this as quite the academic, although your conclusions, I imagine, are not always perhaps something like this, particularly with the Ark of the Covenant. I would think some mainstream biblical scholars would be resistant to the idea that you may have found the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes, I mean, I think people are always utterly resistant to new ways of looking at things, and what I have is a completely new take on the text, and I've found a whole sort of ark tradition that nobody's looked at before. But I think my evidence is pretty robust.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I'm digging it. Don't get me wrong. Because I was looking through this, and I could only imagine, though, how the higher the level of the claim, the more resistant people are going to be to its truth. If you said, I found a pole from the Ark of the Covenant, you would probably get more people might be willing to go along, okay. But to actually find a piece of the Ark of the Covenant, that's the part that's going to be, I would think, hard for some academics to accept, perhaps out of jealousy. Yeah,
well, I don't know what their motives would be, but that might be one. Okay. Academics are notoriously empty.
They sure are. Okay, so before we get there, I want to back up a little bit to some of your other work, because we'll get to the Ark of the Covenant stuff, but there's a reason how you end up finding it, where you found it, and the way you discovered it is the research that you've been doing for a long time about the ancient tribes of Israel, and you've been trying to, track them all down?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I had a kind of slightly more mainstream career until the 1980s, and it just so happened that during the Great Famine in Ethiopia, I was on the borders with the Sudan, and I saw all of those, terrible scenes of starving Ethiopians crossing over into the neighboring country of Sudan. And among them were the so-called falashas, the black Jews of Ethiopia, and Israel was in the process of saving them and getting them to Israel under the very noses of the security guards in Sudan, which is a Muslim Arab League country. And I went on to write a book about that, and of course, given that the Falashas are usually billed as being a black tribe or a lost black tribe of Israel, that excited my interest. And then I wrote, a number of books over my career about different lost tribes or different remote tribes of Israel throughout the world. And so I've had a wonderful, wonderful career. I've traveled all over the place: India, Papua New Guinea, you name it, really.
Well, and so if you could, for the uninitiated, define tribe in the context of the tribes of Israel, and then how you believe they end up in some of the places that you think they might have eventually taken root.
Well, classically, what happened was that at a certain point in history, about 700 BC, the Assyrians swooped on Israel and carted off 10 of the 12 tribes, and they went east somewhere into what is Iraq today, and they kind of never came back, and they were more or less lost, if you like, to history. And subsequently, lots of rumors percolated through from every corner of the globe over many hundreds of years that one of these lost tribes, so-called lost tribes, had popped up. And so it became implicit, if you like, both for Christians and for Jews, that one day the 10 lost tribes would reappear because it's part of biblical prophecy. So that's the beginning, if you like. That's a kind of that's the sort of historical beginning of this thing, and it's used in a way to describe Jewish groups that really haven't had much to do with the mainstream. And it just so happens that, there are such bizarre Jewish groups just about throughout the world, from China to India. And then there are many groups throughout the world, and I dealt with that in my last book, who really don't have any historical connection with Israel or with Jews, but who claim to have, to have some such connection. And
like the black Hebrew Israelites and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to denigrate their claim in any way, but yes, I mean, there are some very bizarre groups out there, from Japan. Well, the Mormons in the United States are a very good example of a group that, claim to have, a connection with Israel without having any particular historical evidence for it.
What about Japan? You said you started to say
that is just the wildest thing, to be honest, because some years ago I was there, and it just so happened that the Crown Prince, Mikasa, who's got a great interest in Middle Eastern things, had been a student at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where I teach, and he I was coming to Japan, and he invited me there, and he told me a good deal about the various traditions in Japan that suggest that the Japanese are themselves a lost tribe of Israel. And indeed, wandering around the country, there are all kinds of, bizarre sites suggesting that Moses was buried, on some mountain in the Northern Ireland and things of this sort. And there's one particular sect, I suppose you'd call it, called the Makuya, who learn Hebrew. They've produced the most beautiful Hebrew-Japanese dictionary, and so I was able to travel all over Japan speaking Hebrew to these Makuya people, and the Makuya believe that they're a lost tribe and that they came from Israel at about 500 or 600 years BC and settled in Japan.
Now, is there a continuity to that claim?
Well, I don't know that there's any historical basis for that claim, but
no. But I mean, does that claim? Do they have do they have buildings that have or paintings or anything that reflect that Judaic understanding of themselves that predate the arrival, say, of the British Empire or American ships or anything like that might have influenced where they got their information?
They would argue that there are certain things. One of the things, for instance, in the case of Japan, is that on the imperial regalia, which is to say things like the scepter, crowns, and so on, there is a mirror, and on the mirror is inscribed the names of the lost tribes. Now, as His Royal Highness Prince Makassar observed dryly to me, nobody has ever seen the royal regalia, not for hundreds and hundreds of years, so nobody could possibly know. But that's one such artifact that people might point to.
What's the oldest extant piece of evidence that they might have to back up their claim that they're a lost tribe?
Well, I would imagine that, the first kind of sort of influence upon them would have been the Portuguese. There were various Jesuits who arrived in Japan during the first period of Christianization, which is the kind of 16th, 17th century.
Right.
And then there are some written Japanese works dating back to that point, speculating, if you like, on connections between the Japanese and the Jews. But essentially, the real kind of wave, the big, great wave that engulfed many, many people, it's an extraordinary story, happens in the 19th century, specifically when a Scottish missionary, formerly a herring fisherman, turns up in Japan and writes an enormous tome explaining precisely how it is that the Japanese are a lost tribe, and of course this had some influence, and it's really another amazing thing, an extraordinary thing when you think of the power of Japan today, is that the Japanese fought against the Russians famously in the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the 20th century.
Sure.
And they started off the war really, really well. They kind of stormed into the Russians and so on. After a bit, they didn't have any gas left. So the various things that they needed petrol or gas for,
right?
They didn't have any, and they didn't have any money either. And so somebody was sent to London to try and get a loan, and he happened to go to one of these gentlemen's clubs in London, and he sat next to an American Jew by the name of Jacob Schiff. And Jacob Schiff had recently lost half his family in some ghastly pogrom in Russia, and so he was only too happy personally to advance a loan to the Japanese. And they went on, of course, to win the war, partly as a result of this American's loan. And he subsequently was the first person ever to be received, non-Japanese person, ever to be received in the imperial palace. And so, one of the things in Japan is that Japanese people, by and large, really believe that Jews have got almost infinite power. And I think that's another kind of thread of their desires in some way to be identified as Jews.
No, it's amazing. Well, so I love that story, but let me ask you about the one in Papua New Guinea, too. Where else are these lost tribes supposedly been all these years?
Well, the truth is that there's no country in the world where you will fail to find a claimant to Israelite ancestry, from the Eskimos through the North American native population, what we used to call Red Indians before we learnt better, South American native populations. Absolutely throughout the world you'll find such people, and in North and South America it was an absolutely major way of understanding their background until, really, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century. It was a major, major way of explaining these native populations.
I'd never heard that about Eskimo. I never heard that about the Inuit. What's that story?
I don't particularly have any. When I wrote my book about it, I think that was one of the groups that I didn't really particularly research. But I do know that at some point in the past they were. I think actually, yes, come to think of it, it comes once again from Jesuits who were working in the northern part of Canada, and they observed their the various customs and beliefs and so on of some of these groups, and they were convinced on the basis of that the only way to explain what they believed in and the sorts of things that they did was that they had come at some point in the remote past from Israel, and they were a lost tribe.
Well, and there's got to be a difference, and you can explain if you would, from those people who are the lost tribes of Israel and Jews that went in hiding or hid their faith, at very least, in community or maintained their faith only through coded words and rituals during times of persecution in the Middle Ages, because that they form communities of people who are not publicly identified as Jews, but they maintain traditional Jewish practices, and they say things and they do things which they may not themselves quite understand why they do them, but that's left over from the fact that they were trying to hide from various church officials.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And you find such groups in Portugal and Spain, and most famously, really, in southern and Central America, where, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, and then from Portugal in 1497, you have an influx of Jews who are kind of pretending to be Christians in order to stay alive. And they go off and settle in Latin America, as it is now, and they secretly practice their Judaism, but presented a Christian face to the world for obvious reasons.
Yeah, including things. I mean, kind of the same sort of practices that you discovered in the tribes in Africa. They were essentially keeping kosher. I mean, in some respects, right? I mean, they weren't eating pork. They didn't eat other things, which seemed to reflect some, perhaps lost, but ancient understanding of themselves as, this is how we define ourselves by what we don't do, or this is how we define ourselves by what we do. And they all seemed to have sort of an echo of Judaism in that.
Exactly that. I mean, sometimes they would light candles on a Friday night. Sometimes they would preserve Jewish names from generation to generation, various stories that didn't have any particular explanation from a Christian standpoint. I think, in terms of my own work, one of the most amazing and beautiful stories really was to do with a particular group like this in India. And they were black. And they spoke a local language, Marathi. They're from the Bombay region in the west of India. And when they were kind of discovered by missionaries in the 18th century, the only bit of their Judaism that they had left was a knowledge of how to kosher prepare fish, and then about three Hebrew words of a prayer. And that was absolutely it. And yet they kind of called themselves, the sons of Israel, and they sort of believed in themselves as Jews, but in every other respect they looked like, Muslims or Hindus or something, but not Jews. And, they became sort of more more obviously Jewish. They encountered other Jews, they learned some Hebrew, they built synagogues over the 19th century, but nobody really ever believed that they actually were Jewish, and there was no intermarriage between them and the local real Jewish community, and the state of Israel was very iffy about them. And then I did some DNA work with these people a few years ago.
Well, hang on to those DNA results. That's just where we'll leave it. We'll come back to it in just a second. Dr. Tudor Parfit's life work has been tracking down lost tribes of Israel in Africa and Asia, professor of Jewish studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies and fellow at Oxford. We'll talk about this coming up in just a second, and how the pursuit of these lost tribes led to the discovery of the lost Ark of the Covenant, next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Talking with Dr. Tudor Parfit, who is a professor of Jewish studies at London's, I guess we should say here because he's British, prestigious School of Oriental and African Studies. And he was just in the middle of a story here, so I want to go to him here before we get the break in, because I just want to get back to that little part. It's so fascinating. You were talking about a group that had a high level of identity with Israel, and yet they did not intermarry with the local Jewish population, yet they considered themselves at least to be a descendant of Israel in some contexts. Even they weren't perhaps sure how, and yet Israel was kind of hot and cold on them. You were saying.
Yeah, I mean, when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, they were allowed to go to Israel, so they were accepted as Jews more or less up to that point. But of course, the state was desperate for immigrants at the time. Anybody could more or less go. There was no restrictions, but no Jews wanted to marry them, and there were great difficulties they had when they were in Israel. I remember being there myself at one point in the 1970s, I think it was. And they were on a hunger strike in Israel simply because they weren't allowed to intermarry with other Jews, and the rabbis wouldn't accept them as being fully Jews or properly Jews. Anyway, when I did the genetic sampling of the group, my geneticist colleagues at University College came up with an absolute match with Jewish communities and their basic oral tradition, which is that they came from Israel around 70 years BC. All of that was completely corroborated by the genetic evidence. It was quite amazing, and that made a banner headline, front page splash in the Times of India, which incidentally is the largest circulation English language newspaper in the world.
Oh, I should think so. You're right. Right, of course. And so at that point, did things change toward them because of the DNA evidence?
Yes, it did. I mean, their first response was to go out into the streets and to dance all night, and they said it was, messianic times for them. And since then, people throughout the world have taken their claims very much more seriously.
All right, so I tell you what, I'd like to do this. I'd like to adjourn for the time being on the subject of the lost tribes, but we'll get back to that because I will get back to the Lemba. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
But let's talk about the Ark of the Covenant next. Well, let's set the stage for your future discovery by talking about the tradition of the Ark of the Covenant and what scholars or archaeologists have been looking for, so that we know just how badly they got it wrong when we get back to the discussion of the discovery that Dr. Tudor Parfit has made. And we'll talk about it next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So, Dr. Tudor Parfit, I think a lot of Americans, at least, if not people around the world, have probably the most enduring image of the Ark of the Covenant from the first Indiana Jones movie. And it's sort of traditionally portrayed as a large box with poles to carry it, on which sits two cherubim, two angels, and then a bunch of kind of writing or pictures around the side, all done in gold. Is that a thumbnail of it?
I mean, that's certainly the Indiana Jones take on it. And that corresponds fairly closely to the description that we have in the Bible, in the book of Exodus particularly. But let's just put ourselves in the context of how it came into the world and why it came into the world and what we know about it.
All right. So starting with Exodus.
I wouldn't. I would start with. I would start with the Book of Deuteronomy. In the Book of Deuteronomy, it's a slightly different story. We have Moses going to the top of of Mount Sinai. This is in the Sinai Desert. They've just left Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They're runaway slaves, and Moses, their rather charismatic, slightly weird leader, goes to the top of the mountain, and God speaks to him, and he says, make an ark to put the stone tablets of the law into. And he does so, and he makes it out of the only wood that grows in those desert regions, which is acacia. You see it in the desert. It's not a huge tree. And it's there to this day. I was just a few weeks ago filming on Mount Sinai, and you have to go quite far down the mountain even today before you find these trees, but they're there still. So he was given the commandment: make a container into which to put the stone tablets of the law, and that's what he did. Now, the other description in the book of Exodus is altogether more elaborate and fancy. And, what happens there, it's not Moses that makes it, it's Moses plus a skilled craftsman called Bezalel. And it's still made with this very wood, but of course it's lined inside and out with gold. It's got a lid, which is made of solid gold, probably. And then on top of it, as you say, there are these cherubim. I should just say that the cherubim have got little in common with the kind of idea that we have of what a cherub is. Cherub is a sweet little chap with a nice fat tummy and
right, like Cupid
wings. Yeah, Cupid sort of creature.
Right.
Nothing like that at all. It was. I think the point here is that in the ancient Near East, from the Hittites in Anatolia to Assyria and Egypt, they all had this way of presenting their gods, which was a kind of platform, and then either side of the platform there'd be some terrifying monster, and then the god would be in the middle, and that's where the god always sat. And so this depiction in the book of Exodus is very similar. In fact, it's identical to the way that gods were always presented. You've got these winged things on both ends, and you've got God in the middle, except in the case of this, as the Israelite God was invisible and he wasn't allowed to be depicted in any way, it's an empty space. And my theory suggests that this is, a very, very much later accretion based upon what the writers of the book of Exodus knew about the way that gods were presented in other neighboring societies, and particularly based upon what the writers of Exodus knew about containers. And anybody who'd been to Egypt would have seen these fabulous things, carried on poles, covered in gold, and they'd be going from temple to temple, and everybody in the region knew all about it. So it was simply that their imagination was nourished by these, Egyptian things, such as in Tutankhamun and so on.
We could say that our typical Hollywood image of cherubim being these sort of delightful little chubby little angel babies, when really we're talking about toddlers who are teething, right? I mean, the real cherubim were more fierce looking. Is that fair to say? Were more menacing looking?
Yes, I think that they were probably kind of winged monsters of some sort.
Right. But doesn't this speak to what some people say is the two ark theory, that Noah builds the first ark as a temporary ark, and then later, when they get more established or they have time, then they make the more formal ark? Is that something that the people have just created to account for the two different ark descriptions?
Well, I mean that's not very likely, simply because the word for the Ark of Noah is not the same word as the Ark for the Ark of the Covenant. The word for the Ark of Noah is Teva, and in Hebrew, and then the word for the Ark of the Covenant is Aaron. Now, it could be that there's some...
No. I think you misinterpreted. I don't mean... No, if I said that in a way that you got that impression. No, I meant that the Moses Ark, that the description in Deuteronomy is more basic, and that perhaps it was a temporary ark, and then the gold ark is made later on when the Israelites are in a different place where they can more formally create something to carry the tablets.
I see your point. Yes, I mean that I think that's a possibility. But let's just remember one thing. The book of Exodus was written many, many, many hundreds of years after the events in the desert. And the people who wrote it, by definition, had never, ever seen the Ark of the Covenant, which was kept in the temple, in the innermost sanctum, which was called the Devir, the Holy of Holies, and the only person who ever saw it was the high priest. So they had to imagine it into existence if they were to write their description.
All right. So again, let's pull back a little bit, because you were talking about this more basic version of the Ark, and I think that's fascinating. But the thought is that the ark then is lost. Whichever version of the ark we're talking about, it disappears somewhere about 500 BC.
Yes, it disappears. Essentially, 586 BC, the city of Jerusalem, capital of Israel, and the site of the temple is destroyed by the invading Babylonian force, and the temple is razed to the ground, and the city is pulled down stone by stone. And after that point, we have no more information about the Ark of the Covenant. We know that it was there shortly before because the Bible describes the precise situation that it was in just a few decades before the destruction. So there's a story which seems completely historical at that point, and then afterwards there's no mention at all in the Bible of the Ark being in Jerusalem, and the only kind of clue that we have is in an apocryphal work which is not included in the biblical canon for most religious groups, which is the second book of Maccabees. And according to the second book of Maccabees, the prophet Jeremiah, who'd lived at the time of the invasion, and who was put in prison for prophesying that it was going to happen. Anyway, according to the second book of Maccabees, he took it across the River Jordan and hid it on a mountain, which is in present-day Jordan, Mount Nebo.
Okay, but from there, other than the second Maccabees account, there is no specific mention of where the ark goes after that, and it's very powerful. I mean, this is something which could generate its own energy. It could, theoretically, the Ark of the Covenant, according to the Testament of what happened at Jericho, it could bring down walls. It could conquer armies. It was indefeatable. And here it was on the lam from the invading Babylonians.
Yeah, well, I don't know about it being undefeatable. It was certainly very powerful, but it was actually captured by the Philistines at one point. So whatever the technology was, it didn't always work.
Okay, it didn't always work.
No, but it did have very considerable powers. Now, there are an enormous number of books out there written by people who, of a somewhat mystic bent, which I am not. Who've explained the power of the ark in different sorts of ways, none of which is even remotely convincing, it seems to me. And I think we just have to reflect in pragmatic, sensible terms as to what technology they may possibly have had,
right,
that would have permitted them to make a vast amount of noise, to zap people with such strength that they died on the spot, and that could conceivably open a path in a river.
Right,
I think
because these are some of the things that
kind of difficult stuff.
Right, these are some of the things that are attributed to the ark, like the fact that they had to keep the ark covered even in front of the priests, because if the priests accidentally saw it, they would die. They would immediately explode or something, right? I mean, there was a feeling that you couldn't look at it, so they kept it covered. But when they took it down to, was it the River Jordan they took it to, and that's what parts later on?
Well, whether it was really because, if you looked at it, you would die, or whether it was that, whatever it was secret, and so therefore it should always be covered up. I think the latter seems more likely. It's rather like these, amazing kind of military processions that one used to see in Moscow and places like that, where the kind of newer arms were covered over with tarpaulins, so you couldn't quite see what they were. And so I presume that it really was a weapon, and that there really was a technology, and it was only the priests who knew about the technology, and they certainly didn't want anybody else to know about it. And that perhaps is the reason that when the ark went into battle against Jericho, which may not be entirely historical, but still in the text what it says, is that there was a mile between where the ark and the trumpets were, and the rest of the Israelite soldiers. There was something about it that the priest didn't want anybody else to know about.
So regardless of what's legend and what's true and what is canonical and what is extra canonical or whatever, the as you tell the story, it's entirely possible that this ark was brought into Africa, and that this is where really it starts to get really interesting as far as I'm concerned. If it goes to Jordan, it doesn't stay there for very long, and starts to make its way into Africa.
Yes, that's what this is what my book, The Lost Ark of the Covenant, suggests. My idea is that it got as far as Jordan, and then it was taken by priests down the frankincense route through Mecca and Medina, and then finally to the southern part of Arabia, what is today Yemen, and it stayed there for some time before finally being taken, which sounds utterly improbable to most people, to Africa, but at the time entirely feasible, because there was like a kind of superhighway which goes from southern Yemen right down to South Africa, which is the sea route, which had the monsoon winds behind ships for 6 months of the year, and then the monsoon winds coming the opposite direction for the second 6 months of the year. It would take, a couple of weeks in a reasonably decent sailing boat to get from South Arabia right down to what is today Mozambique, right at the southern end of the continent. So getting there was no big issue.
And what year are we talking about that you believe the ark would have been moved, or roughly what time, from Jordan to southern Africa?
We have little evidence as to the exact time, but I would reckon it would be about 1000 AD that it was brought to Africa. It might have been a little bit before that, but I think about 1000 AD. I think we will perhaps find out, because the genetic work that was done upon the Central African tribe that is the key to this story will, over the next few months, I hope, be taken up again. And with the more up-to-date technologies which are currently out there, it should be possible for us to date the precise moment at which the Lemba people, the Central African tribe that claims to be Jewish, actually first set foot in Africa. But I would reckon, on the basis of my own research, that that's going to be something like 1000
AD. Okay, good. And that's where we'll pick it up then. As promised, we'll get back to the conversation about the lost tribes of Israel, who are the Lemba. And we'll tell the story of Dr. Tudor Parfit as he, over not a short period of time, ingratiates himself to the Lemba people to the point where they start to share with him some of their mysteries, which coincide nicely with some of his research that he'd already been doing. And we'll tell you the story of why, after a wild night of drinking with the Lemba, he got punched in the face. And what that signified, too, which I have to say, I didn't see it coming, but it's really interesting. It's the story of the lost Ark of the Covenant found after 2,500 years. Where has it been, and how can we prove that? We'll tell you all about it coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Tudor Parfit is the author of 20-some-odd books, as he said earlier, a lot of his work dealing with the lost tribes of Israel, which brings us to the Lemba. If it sounds like I'm painting in very broad strokes, it's because I am. I mean, the details on these books are just fabulous, and he's had the most interesting experiences, and out in the desert, and all of the things he's encountered, his near-death experiences. I wish we had time to go into it all, and I know that there will be some very interesting questions coming up next hour for the man here who says that he has found the lost Ark of the Covenant. It wasn't what you expected it might be, and it wasn't where people thought to look, but he did after meeting with the Lemba. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. It's been missing for 2,500 years, but Dr. Tudor Parfit says he believes he has found the lost Ark of the Covenant, and with a group of people that doesn't exist.